Welcome in, everyone. Landon Renk here, back when Landon talks about sports. And I've been wanting to talk about this video for a long time. Today, we are going to talk about what went wrong in the Brian Ferentz era. Today, we're going to talk about Iowa football offensively. Obviously, I love to talk about the Iowa defense, but we're really just going to talk today about, some of these points per game, some of these seasons. And, a lot of people don't realize it, but Iowa football used to have a good offense a couple of years ago, and we'll talk about this all coming up in today's video. I've been really wanting to talk about this for a long time. Sorry, I'm just pulling something up here. I've been wanting to talk about Brian Ferentz because I'm someone who, I'm not going to say I'm a Brian Ferentz fan, but I'm someone that is pretty passionate about him. I don't think he was as bad as everyone thought he was. I think he had some up and down sides to him. I want to thank Sports Reference today. We're going to be using them a lot to look at Brian Ferentz and just see more about him in his first year. So let's get started. I'm excited to start this one off with the Brian Ferentz era. So to recap everything, if you don't know, Brian Ferentz is Kirk Ferentz's son. Sorry if my camera turned off there. Brian Ferentz is Kirk Ferentz's son, who is the Iowa coach. This is his 4th year, I believe. He started back in 1999. So, he is someone who's been in the Iowa community for a long time. And I mean, he's just someone that people are pretty hyped about. He won Best Offensive Line a couple of years straight when he was the Iowa offensive line coach. And finally, they upgraded him to offensive coordinator in 2017. Ken O'Keefe was the quarterback's coach, and Iowa brought in sophomore quarterback Nate Stanley for his first year of starting. Now, Stanley started off a little shaky. We'll recap through 2017 to start the year off. Stanley's first game against Wyoming wasn't the best. Iowa won 24-3. Then they won against Iowa State 44-41. They made a huge comeback. Akram Wadley had a great game. Then Iowa won 31-14 against North Texas. Then Stanley in his first real test had a heartbreaking loss home against the Penn State Nittany Lions, 19-21 on the last play of the game. Then Iowa fell to Michigan State in 10-17 game, came back and just throttled Illinois 41-16. And then they came through in the 7th game and lost to Northwestern 10-17, then bounced back with a 10-17 Minnesota win. And then the life-changing game. We all know the blackout game. Number 3 Ohio State goes down 55-24 against the Hawkeyes. Then the next week they lose at number 6 Wisconsin 14-38. And then the next week they lose to Purdue 15-24. Then they throttle Nebraska the next week 56-14, and then they beat Boston College in the bowl game 27-20 to end their season 8-5. They were 4-5 in the conference, and they averaged 28.2 points per game. For someone who that was his first season as an offense coordinator, Brian Ferentz, I think that Iowa fans need to look back on that season of 2022-3 and say to themselves, wow, that wasn't that bad of a season. 2017, so many good games in that season. And comment down below what's your favorite Iowa season. I'm a big fan of, odd Iowa seasons, even Iowa years. Even Iowa seasons just seem like they're always the best. You can talk about 1985, 1991, 2015, 2009. And you could even consider this year, 2021. They're just better years, look at statistically. So 28.2 points per game through 2017 is not bad in my opinion. I don't think, 20, 27, 20, 28.2 points per game in 2017 for Brian Ferentz is not bad. I mean, that is not bad for his first year as an offensive coordinator. So, Brian Ferentz, someone who comes in first year as an offensive coordinator, averages 28.2 points per game, puts up a 55-24 win against a great Ohio State team. That's not bad. A good start. Nate Stanley looking like a quarterback that can improve. And then we go to 2018, which is my favorite odd year of all time. We'll start it off with the schedule and results for the 2018 year. I'm sorry that my camera turns off every time that I go to a different screen. But 2018, another interesting year. So 2018 was a good year for the Hawkeyes, and I'll talk about it now. So they opened up the year against Northern Illinois, put up 33 points, that 33-7 win. Then they beat Iowa State 13-3. Then they beat Northern Iowa 38-14. They lose to Wisconsin 17-28. That Wisconsin team was ranked 18th, but it didn't end up being that good of a team that year. I believe they ended the season 8-5 or 7-6. They throttled Minnesota 48-31 the next week in a high-scoring game. Like Iowa fans, that's like Iowa fans' dream right now. And then they have back-to-back 40 points per game when they go into Indiana. So 2 straight road games. They go into Indiana and they win 42-16. So pretty impressive to go into Memorial Stadium and win that game. Then they have homecoming against Maryland. They win 23-0. They have a tough Penn State loss, real tough one. They lose to Penn State 24-30. We all know the story about the interception thrown at the goal line by Nate Stanley, wide open. T.J. Hawkinson overthrew him. We understand Iowa could have probably won that game. Then the next week, just a heartbreaking Purdue loss, 36-38. And then the Hawkeyes fall to Western 10-14. I was at that game. That was the Mile Kennick Memorial game. And then the biggest game of Brian Ferentz era, besides that Ohio State game, was that at Illinois game on November 17th, when they just come into Champaign and they just throttle them 63-0. And then the next week, Iowa defeats Nebraska 31-28 to end the regular season 8-4, second place in the Big Ten West. And then they beat Mississippi State in the Outback Bowl 27-22 in a pretty decent offensive game. So here's my take on this. And Iowa fans, you can agree with me on this because we'll talk about 2019 in a second for Brian Ferentz and for Iowa football. But this was a huge year for Iowa football, personally, for me, because after that Nebraska game, the last time, and this is a huge streak and you'll hear about it, Iowa allowed Nebraska 28 points. After that, until December 4th of 2021, from what day was that in 2018? November 23rd, 2018. Was the last time Iowa allowed more than 28 points until December 4th of 2021. That is over 3 years of not allowing opponents to score more than 28 points per game. And, we'll talk about this year because we know about what happened with this year and 28 points per game. But how? Just, that just seems so crazy that 3 years from November 23rd to December 4th, 2021, Iowa did not allow more than 28 points per game. Like, my God, talk about defense. And this is where you'll start to notice the difference. And it will come up here because this is the epitome of Brian Ferentz's offense here. I forgot to say he averaged 30 points per game. 31.2 points per game. That was 44th out of 130. The Hawkeyes finished with a top 40th offense. Their defense was only allowing 17 points per game that year. So a real good year for Iowa. This, in my opinion, and 2019 is a great year, and we're going to talk about it in a second, this is when things slowly started to go downhill because then there was that big rush after 2020, which we'll talk about. So this is Brian Ferentz's second year. So far, he's averaged 28 points per game, 31 points per game. He's had back-to-back seasons where he's had 40 points games, 63-point games, and now we head to 2019. Nate Stanley's senior year. Iowa has a lot of hope. They have a pretty decent schedule, so can Iowa do well? So we'll start off with the schedule. Iowa opens up the year. Miami of Ohio wins that one 38-14. And now looking back at this, all these non-conference games besides like Iowa State, I believe in the Nate Stanley era, he put up more than 20 points. And it makes me sad looking back. Obviously this year, we'll talk about this year in a second, but about how Iowa could just easily, for a second, I'm just going to talk about Nate Stanley before we go through 2018. Nate Stanley is a non-appreciated quarterback at the University of Iowa. People do not realize that he was more of a game manager. He's that person that can give you plays in big situations. Nate Stanley is someone who Iowa fans need to go back on and look and say, hey, you know what? Like, Nate Stanley was a decent quarterback. He made plays. I can think of plays where he would throw it, and, we'll talk about the wide receivers. Iowa, it's always been tight in you in Iowa, but ever since 2020, the wide receiver core has just been dead. Caleb Brown brings some hope, I guess. Nico Raganini was a frustrating player for me because, this year he was just so unhelpful this year. I have a lot of respect for him. We all know about the Penn State play in 2021. That was, Nico Raganini right there. That is his play, and that's what he will go down in Iowa history as. But, you got to look back and say Iowa used to have those wide receivers. Tyrone Tracy, Amir Smith-Marset, Brandon Smith. You can go back, I mean, tight ends, obviously, but you can go back with some tight ends that played more kind of wide receiver. Noah Fant. TJ Hawkins was obviously a major tight end. Noah Fant technically was listed at a tight end, but I would call him more of a wide receiver type of person. So Iowa's had wide receivers, that play well in these last couple of years, and it's just kind of gone downhill in the wide receiver area from them. So Iowa opens up 2019 with that win against Miami of Ohio. By the way, Iowa was ranked 20th. Then they stay 20th. They shut out Rutgers 30-0. Rutgers has never scored a point at Kinnick Stadium. It's a pretty cool thing to say. Iowa's outscored Rutgers 52-0. Then Iowa State game, a crazy game. Iowa scores 1 touchdown. Keith Duncan was in that game. 4 field goals from Keith. Iowa wins 18-17, and Jack Trice. We all know the muff punt in that game. Then Iowa gets Middle Tennessee State, and they win that one 48-3. 48-3. And Iowa broke the record in that game for the most offensive yards. And this right here, ladies and gentlemen, this right here in another game this year is the epitome of the Iowa offense. There you go. Brian Ferentz, this is where things go downhill from here. Brian Ferentz, that game, and we'll talk about the other game, and we'll go into the 2020 season. But this, after that game, is when Iowa takes a step down. Is when Iowa suddenly is not as powerful on offense. Nate Stanley had a great senior season. He was a great Iowa football player. Iowa gets a bye week between Iowa State and Middle Tennessee State, so it was huge for them to come out, put up 48. Actually, after that Middle Tennessee State game, I got to meet Stanley, so great to meet him. But then Iowa has a huge game against 19th ranked Michigan, and of course, they lose 3-10. And that game's in Ann Arbor. I understand that frustration. Iowa goes black and gold spirit game, comes back to Kinnick, loses 12-17. We all know Brandon Smith's amazing catch. I mean, he just, the over the shoulder, it was like he caught it. I forget how he caught it. It was like a backflip in the air and somehow caught it in the end zone. So that's a reasonable. Those two losses, Michigan and Penn State, are reasonable losses. And this is what frustrates me, is that looking at this year of 2019, Iowa had no losses that weren't reasonable. Iowa lost to all ranked teams. Now, this year you could say, oh, Iowa did lose to three of their 4 losses came to ranked teams, all right? But at least Iowa was kind of pushing it here. All these losses are one-possession games. They beat Purdue the next week 26-20 at homecoming. Then Tyrone Tracy has that huge game, and Tyler Goodson is when we start to realize, hey, these two guys could be the future of Iowa football. The 20-0 win at Rutgers, the 22-24 loss against Wisconsin, even though Tracy played great. Then Iowa has that huge blackout win to end Minnesota's streak, 23-19. They beat Illinois 19-10, and they beat Nebraska on Keith Duncan's game-winning field goal 27-24. Now, before we go to this bowl game, I just want to point out that I told you after that Middle Tennessee State game, that is extremely disappointing. Iowa goes 3-12, 26-20, 22-23, 19-27. That is where we go looking back at last year when we had back-to-back 40-point games and then a 63. And, it's just like this is when Brian Ferentz was kind of having a little bit of I don't want to say an off year, but, he's getting down there. So Iowa now has the Holiday Bowl ranked 19th in the country against 22th ranked USC, and Iowa just blows them out. Nick Niemann got a pick six to end the game, 49-24. Nate Stanley ends his career. This, folks, is the last time Iowa football was good. You'll hear it. You'll hear it from me today. That right there is the most points scored in an Iowa football game since the most points scored in an Iowa football game lately. The last time the most points was scored in an Iowa football game was 49 against USC. Was the last time the Hawkeyes put up over 41 points. 42 points, excuse me. That is extremely sad to hear that the Hawkeyes, and especially in a bowl game against a Pac-12 team, a good USC team, and they ended up averaging that year 5.8 points per game. Brian's drive for 325 would have been right on track. Their points allowed were 14.5. They had the 5th best offense and the 88th best offense and the 5th best defense. So here's my thoughts on 2019. 2019, another interesting year, 28.5 points per game. No one ever believes me when I say this, but 2019 was my favorite Iowa football season. Huge statement, huge bold statement to make. The thing that I'm the most proud of is that I felt like every Iowa loss, I guess the Michigan one, I guess we only put up a field goal, was a true loss. It was a loss that was dug deep down to get. It was a loss that was worth it. It was a loss that Iowa tried. That Wisconsin game, I think Iowa was down by what? They were down by like 10 or something like that, and then they kick a field goal. Or no, they were down by were they down by, what am I trying to say? Iowa was down by 11. That's right, in that game, because they were down 13-24. Iowa comes back, and Tyrone Tracy gets that huge catch, and they just couldn't get the two. And I like to make fun of Nate Stanley best because it's a very weird stat. Nate Stanley was 0 for 4 on 2-point conversions in his career. I believe it was maybe 0 for 4, 0 for 5. Spencer Petras was 2 for 2. Cade McNamara's 1 for 1. Deacon Hill's 0 for 1, that one against Rutgers. So it's an interesting stat to have. You got to be able to convert 2-point conversions. It's from the 2-yard line, and it talks about red zone struggles, obviously, with Iowa. But I told you, they went from having the 44th best offense in the country to the 88th. This is where we take a step back, and that win against USC starts the downfall of the Iowa offense. 2020, the COVID year, is a very interesting year. It's actually a year that I'm really proud of the team because it is an up and down year, and you guys are going to ask me about this because I just said that Iowa had a downfall of offense, but this was actually their best offensive year on the Brian Ferentz Era. So Spencer Petras comes in at quarterback, and Iowa has a horrible start to the season. They lose to Purdue 20-24, then they lose to Northwestern 20-21. Then they come back and thump a Michigan State team that comes off a big Michigan win 49-7. They beat Minnesota 35-7. They beat Penn State 41-21. At Penn State, think about it. When was the last time we won at Penn State before that? That would be a question for Hawkeye fans to answer because it's a long time. We beat Nebraska 26-20, beat Illinois 35-21, and then beat Wisconsin to end the season 28-7. They had Michigan scheduled for the next Saturday. They got canceled. Their bowl game against Missouri, I believe, was canceled too. So a sad one to hear about. But Iowa ended up 6-2. They had the 19th best team in the country, and they averaged 31.8 points per game. They had the 40th best offense. They only allowed 16.0 points per game, 6th best in the country. So now here's where you go and say, Landon, well, why did you say Iowa took a step back in offense? Why did you say that this was the beginning of the downfall of Iowa? It's because Spencer Petras really didn't look that good that year. Yeah, you can say that 42-point game against Michigan State, but then you look at it and you go, Riley Moss had a pick six. Charlie Jones returned a punt. There's 14 points less. Little plays from the defense. Spencer Petras handing off the ball to Tyler Goodson. It's stuff like this in that 2020 season that, makes it pretty special. And I would say 2020 was a great year to end it off with 6 wins. To have that happen is just great. Just great for the Hawkeyes. It is really just great. Because, that makes me proud as an Iowa fan to say, what, hey, we ended off a season that didn't start off pretty well, and, we ended it off pretty well. And, that year was a drop down in offense. Again, I told you, look back on the points we scored. We did 20, 20, 49, 35, 41, 26, 35, 28. You would say, yes, we never scored less than 20 points like in 2019. I get it. This was a COVID year. Things weren't count. This doesn't even actually count now for players. And I'm sorry about my camera. That this doesn't actually count for any players now because now this year doesn't count and they get an extra COVID redshirt year. So now let's move on to 2021. And then this is where things take a downhill. 2021 had a lot of hype coming into it, especially with Iowa's schedule, looking at it saying Iowa, if they could just beat Penn State and a good Iowa State team, they could easily make it to the Big Ten Championship and maybe even make a run. And this year is fairly disappointing for me because we know about the hype, how the season started. Iowa starts off the year playing against a 17th ranked Indiana team that ended up being like a 4-win team. They win that game 34-6. They beat Iowa State the next week 27-17. Then they beat Iowa. Then they beat Kent State 30-7. They beat Colorado State 24-14. They thump a Maryland team 51-14. And by the way, at this point, Iowa was 5th ranked in the country. And then the game. Number 3 Iowa, number 4 Penn State, 2021. This ended up being the most hyped up game in the middle of the season. Penn State, after this game, ended up losing their last, I believe, they went 1 for 6, or 2 for, Penn State went 2 for 6 in their last couple of games after this. In their last 8 games after this, they went 2 for 6. That is just embarrassing. That is just embarrassing. We know the story. Iowa down 16-20. Spencer Petras rolls, the call from Gus Johnson. Petras rolls, looks left side, caught, out of bounds, touchdown Iowa, Nico Reganey. We all know that call. And Iowa rushes the field. They start the year off 6-0, and they're number 2 in the country. And then the next week, Purdue comes in and David Bell just beats the crap out of them. Then they lose to Wisconsin the next week. And that Penn State game right there, folks, is the ending. And I'm going to, you're going to keep hearing me say this, is another, I want to call a section of an Iowa downfall. We've explained the ultimate hype of the Iowa run. The ultimate hype of the Iowa run is the 2018 season up until that Middle Tennessee State game. Obviously the Iowa State game, they won the 18-17. But besides that right there is where Brian Ferentz started to drop down. That is where Brian Ferentz, his offense started to regress. And then that second section is the USC bowl game when Iowa puts up 49. That is when a true downfall starts. And then the third section is that 2020 season. It was a great season all through that. And this third section begins after that Penn State game. Iowa loses both of those games, only puts up 7 points, puts up 17 against Northwestern, ends up benching Petras, beats Minnesota 27-22, beats Illinois 33-23, beats Nebraska 28-21, gets clobbered in the Big Ten Championship 3-42, and loses a heartbreaking Citrus Bowl 17-20. Ends the year 10-4, might sound familiar. They ended up being ranked all year, ended up being in the top 25 every single week, which was great. They did that in 2019 and in this year. So just a very disappointing season for Hawkeye fans. And Spencer Petras, Iowa's offense, only averaged 23.4 points per game, 100th best offense. Their defense allowed 19.2. So an interesting year for Iowa in 2021. Brian Ferentz, at this point, the thing is that looking back on 2021 is Brian Ferentz wasn't in the doghouse yet. This is why, is because I guess 19th best offense is not what you want as a fan. You do not want the 19th best offense in the country. It's a joke. I get that. I get that Brian Ferentz was struggling at that point. But did this spark it? It did. Spencer Petras is announced the starter. It was a tough challenge in the offseason. Alex Padilla versus Spencer Petras. The 2022 season begins, and this might be the most disappointing Iowa season I've seen since 2014. 2016 was a pretty disappointing year. Same record as this year. 2017 was not disappointing, even though they ended up with the same record. But this is just a sad year to hear about, and it's just tough to hear. So Iowa opens up the year against a non-major team in South Dakota State. And this is the worst game on earth. Iowa opens up the game in the second drive. They have an obvious field goal situation. And Aaron Blom, who ended up not being Iowa's kicker anymore, and Hawkeye fans wish Drew Stevens would have been Iowa's kicker. We'll figure out that later on by then. Misses a field goal in the early moments. He gets one back. And Iowa wins the game, getting 2 safeties to nothing. Iowa wins the game 7-3 against South Dakota State. And then the next week, Iowa State comes in, and we know the story. Iowa, they're looking great. They block a punt, score a touchdown on their first drive of defense. Then in the second half, up 7-3, they get 2 interceptions in the red. They get an interception in the red zone. They stop Iowa State at a fumble on the goal line. And then it happens. Monty Potterbaum fumbles at the 1-yard line. Iowa State recovers, takes it for a touchdown. Iowa, in their last drive, gets right into field goal range, and Aaron Blom absolutely misses a 49-yarder for the win. Iowa fans lose to Iowa State for the first time since 2014. Heartbreaker, 7-10. Iowa is only averaging at this point 7 points per game. That right there is just embarrassing. Just embarrassing. Iowa has Nevada, a little bounce back. That game ended up ending at midnight, 27-0. For that game. Then Iowa, another bounce back win, 27-10, even though they got 2 defensive touchdowns in that game. Then they actually did pretty well against 4th-ranked Michigan. They lose that one 14-27, and then this is where the pitfall starts. The last time Iowa had a losing record was when they were 0-2 in 2020. And that I wouldn't really even count. I would say the last time Iowa record in a season was the year of 2000 in, I believe, 12. 2012 sounds about right. Last time Iowa had a losing record mid-season. So that was just, this is embarrassing. Iowa loses to Illinois the next week, 6-9, in just an embarrassing game. Spencer Petras can't do anything. They get blown out by Ohio State the next week, 10-54. By the way, that one offensive touchdown came from it was actually a defensive touchdown. Then they come back, beat Northwestern 33-13. They have a little bit of a bright offensive spread. And this is the part right here that I think saves Brian Ferentz. Beats Northwestern 33-13. Iowa comes out of the depths to be in front in the Big Ten West and have a chance to make it to the Big Ten Championship. Beat Purdue on the road 24-3, beat Wisconsin 24-10, beat Minnesota 13-10, and then the disappointing game. I was there. We know story at Nebraska. It was a disappointing loss for Iowa. They lose down 24-0. Alex Padilla comes into the game, tries to make a comeback. Hawkeyes lose 27-24 and don't get into the Big Ten Championship. Iowa would end up bouncing back and beating Kentucky 21-0 in a useless Music City Bowl to end the year 8-5. And this, my folks, is another downfall. This right here is another segment called the depths part. By that Nebraska game when Iowa was 7-5, that is the worst we have seen this Iowa team since 2017 when they were 7-5. A team that you're the only average 17 points per game. Their opponents only scored 13 points per game on them. Second in the country on defense and 123rd in the country on offense. And Brian Ferentz right now is in the doghouse by now. 17 points per game after having seasons where he goes, I believe, first season 28, 31, 25, 28, 31, then that last season with the 17. So really disappointing, that one. 17.7 PPGs for that Hawkeye team in 2022. That is a disappointment. But hope came. Cade McNamara, Michigan's quarterback from 2021, who led them to the college football playoffs, led them to a Big Ten championship, comes in, transfers to Iowa. Eric All, Caleb Brown comes, Seth Anderson comes. Iowa gets some defense. Iowa gets some offensive line. It looks like Iowa can have a great year in 2023, and here's where it all goes down. I was extremely hyped for 2023 because I've told you odd years are great in Iowa football. Statistically, you look at odd years and you say that is the prime of Iowa football. 2023 was extremely disappointing. Extremely disappointing. And it's not any of the transfers' fault because we're going to talk about that right now. Iowa opens up the season against Utah State. They're ranked 25th in the country. And the first play of the game, Caleb Johnson returns the kickoff to the Utah State 49. First pass play of the game, Cade McNamara throws a touchdown pass to Seth Anderson. First pass play of his career. Second drive, gives it to Eric All, another transfer from Michigan on a 4th and goal. Third drive, Iowa goes for it on 4th down, doesn't get it. Iowa ends up winning that game 24-14. Should have probably scored more against that Utah State game. A little bit more concerning to only win by 10. But hey, it's better than a 7-3 win to start the season. Then they have an okay game against an Iowa State team that ended up being pretty good this year. They win 20-13. Then they have a pretty decent game against Western Michigan where they put up 41 points. And I told you, the last time Iowa put up 49 points was 2019. This is the closest they got. In this game, they barely even put up any offensive yards, but they had no defensive touchdowns in this game somehow. So Iowa offense, kudos to them for putting up 5 touchdowns on the board. So good for them. And we saw 2 from Kamari Moulton, 1 from Deontay Vines, 1 from Max White, and 1 from LaShawn Williams. So good for them. Iowa gets throttled against number 7 Penn State 0-31, their first ranked team they play all season. They come back. I was at the game against Michigan State Blackout. Cooper Jean game-winning punt return, and that is where things go downhill. I forgot to say, but in that Western Michigan game, Eric All gets hurt. Luke Lachey gets hurt. Iowa's top tight end out. Eric All in the air needs to take the position. And All looked really good. Scored a touchdown in the Michigan State game. But sadly enough, second drive of the game, Cade McNamara gets hurt. Season-ending injury, tears his ACL. Deacon Hill, 220-pound quarterback, transfer from Wisconsin, never played since 2021 when he was in high school, comes into the game. And he didn't play too bad in that game. Had over 100 passing yards, threw a passing touchdown, did what he needed to do. Second game of the year, did what he needs to do again. Iowa wins 20-14 against Purdue. Did what he needs to do again at Wisconsin. Comes back, wins 15-6. And we all know the story about the Wisconsin game. Eric all goes down. Iowa is down now to their tight ends and their wide receivers that are just struggling. And it's tough. It really is for the Hawkeyes. So this Iowa team gets back in the rankings and plays against Minnesota and just looks horrible. We know the story. Cooper DeJean, game-winning punt return. They call it out for an invalid fair catch. This is the deaths of Iowa. They're 6-2 somehow, but they're looking horrible. They come back and play a horrible game against Northwestern. They win it, though, 10-7. Then against Rutgers, they put up 22. Against Illinois, they put up 15 to clinch the Big Ten West. Then and Cooper DeJean gets hurt in the Rutgers game during after practice. Beat Nebraska on a crazy game winner. We know that story, 13-10. Then they get blown out by Michigan, 0-26 in the Big Ten championship game. And then recently they got blown out by Tennessee, 35-0 in the Citrus Bowl. 92-0 against ranked opponents this year. Got shut out 3 times for the first time in the Kirk Ferentz era since 1999. This is the most disappointing season. Talk about a tale of two halves, but it's not truly. This is in just Brian Ferentz, obviously, after the Minnesota game was announced that he would not be returned. We would not return. Here, listen to this. 14.8 points per game allowed on defense. 4th out of 133 in the country. 15.4 points per game on offense. 132nd of 133. They put up 216 points. They were 109 points behind the drive for 325. And they got an extra football game. Extremely disappointing this year. Extremely disappointing. Brian Ferentz, the way he went down, the way he had this train wreck of a story as the Iowa offensive coordinator is extremely disappointing. I'm going to put up some of his stats here in the chat like I was talking about. This is just extremely disappointing about Brian Ferentz, about how it all went down. A coordinator who first year puts up 28 points per game, second year, 31 points per game, third year, 25 points per game. Next year, 31 points per game. Next year, 23.8. And then 17. And then 15. It was a roller coaster of a story. I said I love odd years. This still was great to have a 10-4 season. At one point, we were 10-2. We could have won that Minnesota game. We could have been 11-1 coming into that Minnesota game. Brian Ferentz, what went wrong? The answer is that he just could not continue to play quarterback. We know the story of how Iowa quarterbacks are made, and the transfer portal hurts it a lot. Iowa quarterbacks, they come in their freshman year, they get redshirted, they get trained, they get developed by great quarterback coaches like Ken O'Keefe, who grew Nate Stanley. And then he leaves, and Brian Ferentz is now the new quarterbacks coach. He makes Spencer Petras. He helps develop Spencer Petras. He helps develop a part of Cade McNamara's play. He helps develop Deacon Hill. And you know what happens? Is it ends up going all to the transfer portal. Because this is the problem. Iowa quarterbacks, I told you, come in their first year. They get developed. They start their second, third, and fourth year. The problem is that the last 3 years, Iowa's third and fourth string quarterbacks have continued to enter the transfer portal. 2021, Deuce Hogan, third string quarterback, needs to stay to be developed because he would have been extremely helpful for the 2022 season to have another quarterback. Even for now, he probably could have been the starter once Cade McNamara goes down. Petras would have been the starter probably if he would have not have got injured last year. But you know what? You shake your hips and you say, I mean, this is what happens. Is that the transfer portal. Second year, Carson May transfers out. Now his third string quarterback. The year before, that was this year, Joe Labas, who looked great in the bowl game, transfers out. This is what I'm saying now to Marco Linus. Do not transfer out. We know the news about Ty Thompson. Huge news. Oregon backup quarterback, a former 5-star quarterback, now listed at 4-star. Taking a visit to Iowa. Great for Cade. Cade should not be frustrated about this because if Cade McNamara gets a quarterback that is as good as him or better, and we can play Cade McNamara, Marco Lainez, if we can at least have the possibility that if Cade goes down or if Cade's not looking good, that we can have Ty Thompson come into the game, or worst case, Marco Lainez, and worst case, Deacon Hill. And who cares? Hill can transfer out. I just really hope Marco understands. Unless Ty Thompson, who would started in 2021, redshirted that year, so technically this is only his sophomore year. He next year would be his junior year. He would be our starter in 2025. In his fifth year. So Marco needs to stick around. I'm assuming, I believe he redshirted this year, or if he doesn't next year redshirt, that he'll have, say this year he redshirted, so next year would technically be his freshman. He would get to start in his sophomore. Then he would go junior, senior. So he would exactly follow the Iowa formula. He would follow the formula that Spencer Petras followed. 2018, he redshirted. 2019, he was developed. 2020, started 2021, 2022. That's the story. Nate Stanley obviously didn't ever use that red shirt. 2016, he came in, got developed. 2017, 2018, 2019. He could have used that extra year, but instead he went to the NFL draft. So, Iowa quarterbacks, where's this offense going now? Whoever's the next Iowa offense coordinator, all you need to know is you need to know that you are not going to be our quarterbacks coach. We are going to find our own quarterbacks coach. We are going to find someone that knows exactly how to develop quarterbacks, and we're going to have a great season next year. Iowa's schedule is extremely winnable next year. I'm going to talk about it right now. We have some big games next year. Big games, big boy games to show that we don't get shut out. So really, really, really excited to see about this. Let's talk about Iowa's games in 2024. They open up the year. Illinois State, Iowa State, Troy, at Minnesota, at Ohio State, Washington. Right there. If we can win one of those games at Ohio State or versus Washington, I always count more on the versus Washington game. I'm assuming that will be a black and gold spirit game. So you know what? Let's see about that, if what can happen in that game. So then you got at Michigan State, homecoming against Northwestern versus Wisconsin. Assume that game would probably be blackout military appreciation, at UCLA, at Maryland. They take a bye between that and then versus Nebraska down the season. So they have not yet announced the types of games for the year, so we won't know yet which will be like the black and gold spirit game or whatever, but it's very interesting. So, I'm really excited for, really, really, really excited for next year's season, and it should be a good one. I want to thank everyone for watching the stream. I saw that we had 2 people when we started off our stream today, so I want to thank whoever those people who were watching our stream earlier today. We have 0 now. But, if you want to go back and watch the stream and just talk about what went wrong in the Brian Ferentz era, by the way, I'm a 13-year-old kid talking about Iowa football, so if you're impressed with my skills, comment down below. I'm trying to become a sports broadcaster. Make sure to like and subscribe to my channel. We're on the road to 100 subscribers. Let's go Hawks. We got to get this win tonight against Rutgers women's basketball. Men's basketball is really struggling in the Big Ten Conference right now, really struggling. We need to find that. Tony Perkins looks like our leader. Let's see what we can do. Go Hawks till the game is won.